They were selling her for a debt she couldn't even remember owing. And by sundown, the man who paid it would be the only thing standing between her and something far worse. Before we go on, picture the heat. 98 degrees, no wind, dust sitting heavy like it had weight, the kind that sticks to your throat when you breathe. Clara Whitmore knelt in that dust, right in the middle of Redemption Street, her hands resting on her thighs like she'd already accepted the ground as her place. Her dress was simple, pale once, now faded and marked by travel, by time, by too many doors closed in her face. The town gathered without being asked. Men leaning on posts, women watching from shaded windows, boots shifting slow in the dirt. No one spoke for her. No one ever did. The man holding her debt read from a folded paper like it was scripture, voice loud enough for every year. $37.80, due in full, he said, tapping the number like it carried more truth than her name ever had. Clara didn't argue. She just looked down, blinking slow, like each second was heavier than the last. You sign, he continued, holding out the paper, or you work it off my way. And the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was agreement. That was how things worked out here. No law needed when everyone knew their place. A laugh slipped from somewhere near the saloon door, low and careless. Boots shifted again. A chair creaked. Then a shadow crossed the sun. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady. Ethan Cole stepped forward like a man who had already made his decision miles before he ever reached this street. His coat was dust-worn, his hat pulled low, but there was something in the way he moved, measured, quiet, that made a few heads turn before they realized they were looking. He didn't greet anyone, didn't ask a question. He reached into his pocket, pulled out folded bills, and placed them on the wooden rail beside the debt holder with a soft, final sound. That's enough, he said, not loud, but it carried. The man blinked, counted without meaning to, lips tightening as the numbers matched. For a moment, the whole street held still, like even the sun had paused to see what would happen next. Clara lifted her head slowly, eyes searching his face for something, an explanation, a catch, a reason, but found none. Why? She asked, voice barely more than breath. Ethan didn't answer, didn't look at her long enough to give hope a place to stand. He just nodded once toward the money and turned his back like the matter had already faded from his mind. The crowd shifted again, softer this time, uncertain. The debt holder stepped away, folding the paper with less confidence than before. Clara rose to her feet, unsteady at first, like freedom didn't fit her yet. And as she did, something slipped from her neck, a small silver pendant, worn but polished by time, catching the sunlight for just a heartbeat before settling against her collarbone. Ethan saw it, not with surprise, but with recognition so faint it could have been mistaken for nothing. He slowed, just half a step, then kept walking. Behind him, Clara stood alone in the middle of the street that had just decided. She was no longer worth watching. It should have ended there, a paid debt, a quiet exit, dust settling back into place. But the West had a way of collecting its dues twice, because somewhere beyond the ridge, past the line where heat bends the air, a sound began to rise, distant at first, then steady, hoofbeats, measured, coming closer with purpose. One rider could be a traveler, two might be trouble. But the rhythm building in that distance said something else entirely, and though no one spoke it out loud, the feeling spread the way it always does, slow, cold, certain, that whatever had just been settled on that street wasn't finished yet. The sound reached the town before the riders did, a low, steady rhythm that did not belong to cattle or travelers, something more deliberate, like men who already knew where they were going. Ethan Cole heard it the same way everyone else did, but he did not turn right away. He just slowed his walk along the edge of the street, boots pressing into dust that had not yet settled, his hand hanging loose by his side, not reaching for anything, not signaling fear. Behind him, Clara Whitmore stood frozen, her eyes locked on the horizon where the heat shimmer began to break into shapes, dark figures forming one by one. The townspeople felt it too, that quiet shift in the air when curiosity turns into caution, when doors that had been half open begin to close inch by inch. One man cleared his throat and stepped back into the shade. Another adjusted his hat lower, pretending not to see. Nobody wanted to be part of what was coming. The first rider crested the ridge at a measured pace, not rushing, not hesitating, his horse moving like it had traveled long miles without tiring. Then another followed, then another, until 7 riders spread across the edge of town, their spacing precise, their presence enough to pull the last bit of sound from the street. They were not lawmen, not ranch hands, not anything that belonged here. Their coats were darker, their posture straighter, their silence heavier. Ethan stopped now, just at the edge of the boardwalk, and turned his head slightly, not enough to face them fully, just enough to see. Clara took one step backward without meaning to, the heel of her boot catching in the dirt, her breath tightening as one of the riders leaned forward in his saddle and studied her like he had been searching for something lost. "Took you long enough," the man said, his voice calm but carrying, and the name he spoke next did not belong to Clara Whitmore. It was softer, older, spoken like memory rather than accusation. Clara's face drained of what little color remained, her fingers instinctively reaching for the pendant at her neck, pressing it against her chest like it could disappear if she held it tight enough. Ethan noticed that movement, the way her hand closed around the silver, the way her shoulders drew in as if the world had suddenly narrowed to a single point. He shifted his weight, just slightly, and that was enough. The lead rider's eyes moved to him now, measuring, curious. "This does not concern you," the rider said, not unkind, not loud, just certain. Ethan did not answer right away. He let the silence sit, let the dust move between them, let the weight of every watching eye settle where it would. Clara's voice came then, barely steady. "Please, just go," she said, not looking at him, not daring to. It was not a request for help, it was a warning. Ethan glanced at her, just once, and there was something in his expression that did not match the moment, something older than the street, older than the riders, something that had already made its choice long before this day. He turned fully now, stepping down from the boardwalk into the dirt, placing himself in the open space between Clara and the approaching line. Not close enough to challenge, not far enough to leave doubt. The riders slowed their horses, not stopping, but not advancing either, as if testing the boundary he had just drawn without words. One of them shifted in the saddle, exchanging a brief look with the man in front, and for the first time since they arrived, uncertainty touched their formation. The lead rider studied Ethan more carefully now, eyes narrowing just enough to notice the details others might miss, the way he stood, the way his hands remained empty, the way he did not ask questions. "You paid a debt that was not yours," the rider said after a moment, his tone changing, less certain, more probing. Ethan's gaze did not move. "Maybe," he replied quietly. The wind picked up just enough to lift the edge of Clara's dress, to carry a thin line of dust across the space between them, and in that small movement, the pendant slipped free again, catching the light in a brief sharp flash. The rider saw it. His expression shifted, not to anger, not to relief, but to recognition. "That belongs to someone," he said slowly. Ethan's eyes followed the glint, just for a second, and something in him tightened, something buried under years of silence. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, steadier. "Then maybe you should tell me who you think she is." The street did not breathe anymore. It just waited, the kind of waiting that stretches seconds into something heavier than time itself. And in the middle of it stood a man who refused to move and a woman who did not know where to stand. The lead rider studied Ethan Cole like he was reading a page that did not belong in the book, eyes moving from his boots to his hands to the stillness in his shoulders, searching for the part that would give him away, but finding nothing. Clara felt it too, that shift, that quiet fracture in control, and it scared her more than anything the riders had brought with them. "You do not ask questions," the rider said slowly, his voice softer now, almost curious. Ethan did not look away. "Not the kind you want answered," he replied, calm, measured, like he was not standing between her and 7 mounted men. A flicker of something passed between the riders, not fear, not yet, but hesitation. And that was enough to change the balance. Clara swallowed, her fingers still tight around the pendant, and for the first time she spoke louder, her voice finding something beneath the fear. "It is not worth it," she said, her eyes fixed on the ground, not daring to meet his. Ethan glanced back at her, just for a second, and there it was again, that same quiet recognition, the kind that does not belong to strangers. The lead rider leaned forward slightly, resting one hand on the saddle horn, his gaze sharpening as if a thought had just settled into place. That pendant, he said. It was not made in this town, not in any place like it. His eyes shifted to Clara, then back to Ethan, and it was not meant to be worn by someone hiding under another name. The wind carried the words across the street, and even those pretending not to listen felt them land. Clara closed her eyes for half a heartbeat, and in that moment, the truth pressed closer to the surface than she could hold back. Ethan took a slow breath, not deep, just enough to steady something inside him that had started to move. Then maybe you should say it plain, he said, his voice even, but quieter now, like he was not speaking to the rider anymore. The man studied him a moment longer, then gave a small nod, more to himself than anyone else. Her name is not Clara Whitmore, he said, and the name that followed was not loud, but it carried weight. The kind that does not need volume to be heard. Clara's shoulders tightened, her grip on the pendant loosening just enough for it to fall against her chest again. The silver catching the light in a way that felt different now. Heavier. The town shifted again, a ripple of unease passing through those still watching from doorways and windows. Because names mattered out here, and this one did not belong to someone who owed $37.80. Ethan's expression did not change, but something in his eyes did, something that had been buried under miles of dust and years of silence. You have been looking for her, he said, not as a question, but as a statement that had already found its answer. The rider nodded once. A long time, he replied, and there was no threat in it, only purpose. Clara's voice came again, softer now, almost breaking. I told you to leave, she said, and this time she looked at Ethan, really looked at him, as if trying to understand why he had not walked away when he still could. Ethan held her gaze for a brief moment, and in that silence, something passed between them that had nothing to do with debts or riders or names. Then he turned back, placing himself more firmly between her and the men, not closer, not aggressive, just certain. You found her, he said. Now what? The question hung there, simple on the surface, but heavy underneath, because it forced something the riders had not yet spoken out loud. The lead rider straightened in his saddle, the faintest hint of respect settling into his posture, like he was no longer looking at a stranger, but at a man who had stepped into something he understood without needing it explained. That depends, the rider said slowly, his eyes flicking once more to the pendant, then back to Ethan, on whether you are standing there for her, or for what that belongs to. The dust moved again, a thin line drifting between them, and for a moment, no one spoke, because the answer to that question was not something that could be taken back once it was given. The question did not move through the air, it settled, heavy and still, and every man on that street knew that whatever came next would not be undone. Ethan Cole did not answer right away, not because he did not know, but because some answers carry weight the moment they are spoken, and out here, weight had a way of changing everything. Clara felt it before he said a word, the shift in him, subtle but certain, like a door closing behind a choice already made. Her fingers loosened from the pendant, letting it rest against her chest, no longer hidden, no longer denied. The lead rider watched that small movement, and something in his expression softened, not in weakness, but in understanding. You should not be here, Clara said quietly, her voice steady now, stripped of the panic that had held it before. None of this belongs to you. Ethan finally spoke, his tone low, even, but firm in a way that did not invite argument. It does now. The words were simple, but they carried further than anything shouted that day. A murmur passed through the edges of the town, quickly swallowed by silence again. The riders did not move, but their horses shifted, sensing the tension that men tried to hide. The lead rider exhaled slowly, as if measuring the space between what he wanted and what stood in front of him. You think this is about a woman with a false name, he said, but it is not. His gaze dropped briefly to the pendant, then returned to Ethan. That piece of silver carries more than memory. Ethan's eyes followed for just a second, and this time he did not hide the recognition. It was faint, buried under years, but it was there. Clara saw it, and her breath caught, not in fear, but in something closer to realization. You have seen it before, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan did not answer her directly, but his silence spoke enough, the lead writer noticed. And the corners of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, not quite relief. Then you understand why we cannot leave without it, he said. Clara shook her head, stepping slightly to the side, not away from Ethan, but into view, as if choosing to be seen rather than hidden. It is not something you take, she said, her voice steady. It is something that was given. The words changed the air again, subtle, but real. The riders exchanged another look, and for the first time, their formation felt less certain, less fixed. Ethan shifted his stance, just enough to remain between them, but not to block her voice. He was not speaking for her. He was standing with her. The lead rider studied them both. Now, longer than before, as if the answer he had come for was not the one he expected to find. Given to who? He asked. Clara met his gaze, her shoulders straight, her fear no longer leading. To someone who did not ask for it, but did not throw it away either. The wind moved through the street again, lifting dust in slow circles, brushing against boots and coat hems like a quiet reminder that nothing here stood still for long. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in thought. Something connecting in a place he had not touched in years. A memory, half buried, of a different time, a different voice, and a promise that had not been spoken in words. He looked at Clara again, not as a stranger now, but as a question he was beginning to understand. That pendant, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. It was never meant to be found twice. The lead writer heard it, and this time, he did smile, faint and knowing. Then maybe, he said, it was never lost. The silence that followed was different from before, not tense, not sharp, but waiting, like something had reached the edge of being revealed. Clara's hand moved again, not to hide the pendant, but to hold it steady, as if she had finally decided not to run from what it meant. Ethan stood beside her, not moving, not leaving, and in that stillness, the line between them and the riders was no longer just distance, it was choice. And out here, choice was the one thing no man could take without consequence. Out here, the truth never arrives loud. It settles in the silence between men who already know what it means. The street held that silence now, stretched thin between the riders and the two figures standing in the dust, and for the first time since they had arrived, the men on horseback did not look certain of what came next. Ethan Cole stood as he had before, not taller, not louder, just present in a way that did not shift under pressure. And beside him, Clara no longer looked like someone waiting to be claimed or judged. She looked like someone who had finally stopped running. The pendant rested against her chest, catching the light in small, steady flashes, no longer hidden, no longer something she tried to protect from sight. The lead rider studied it again, longer this time, as if confirming something he had hoped was not true, or perhaps something he had traveled too far to doubt now. You kept it, he said quietly, and there was no accusation in his voice, only a kind of weight that comes with long memory. Clara met his gaze without lowering hers. I did not know what it meant, she said, only that it was not mine to throw away. The words settled differently than anything before them, because they carried no defense, no excuse, only honesty. The other riders shifted slightly, not forward, not back, but enough to show that whatever they had expected to find in this town, it was not this. Ethan's eyes moved between them, reading not their hands, not their weapons, but their hesitation, and that told him more than anything else could. Then you know, he said slowly. This is not something you take back by force. The lead rider gave a small breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. If it were that simple, he replied, we would not be standing here talking. The wind carried that answer across the street, brushing against the empty space where the crowd had thinned, leaving only those who could not bring themselves to walk away from what they did not understand. Clara's hand rose again, not to clutch the pendant, but to hold it still, as if steadying something inside herself. Then why follow me? She asked. If you believe it cannot be taken. The rider's eyes softened just enough to show that the question mattered, because it was never meant to be lost to silence, he said. And you have been silent a long time. Clara looked down for a moment, not in shame, but in reflection, And when she looked back up, there was something clearer in her expression, something that had not been there before. Ethan saw it, and whatever doubt might have remained in him faded with it. He took one step forward, not toward the riders, but beside Clara, closing the space that had separated them by inches before, making it clear without words that he was no longer deciding whether to stand there. He already had. The lead rider noticed, and this time, he did not question it. Instead, he shifted in his saddle, easing the tension from his posture, not surrendering, but adjusting to a truth he had not expected. There are men who would come for that, he said, his voice lower now, meant more for Ethan than the town. Not like us, not to speak first. Ethan's gaze held steady. Then they will find us already standing, he answered. The simplicity of it carried more certainty than any threat. Clara turned her head slightly toward him, not fully, just enough to see him in the corner of her eye. And there was something in that look that had nothing to do with fear anymore. The riders exchanged one last glance, and something passed between them, silent, understood. The lead rider straightened, gathering the reins lightly, and for the first time since they arrived, his horse shifted not forward, but back half a step. Then we will not take it today, he said. And though the words were calm, they carried a promise rather than an end. Ethan did not respond, because he understood that as well. The rider's gaze moved to Clara one last time. But silence does not hold forever, he added, and then, without another word, he turned his horse. One by one, the others followed, not hurried, not defeated, just leaving the way they had come, carrying their purpose with them. The sound of hoofbeats faded slowly, swallowed by distance, until the street was left with nothing but dust and the echo of something that had not yet finished. Clara exhaled, a breath she had been holding longer than she realized, and the pendant rested still against her chest. Ethan remained where he stood, watching the horizon where the riders had disappeared, his expression unchanged, but his presence rooted deeper than before, because out here, some things do not end when men ride away. They only begin when they choose not to. When the dust finally settled, it did not bring relief. It brought clarity, the kind that makes a man realize the road ahead has already chosen him. The town began to breathe again, slowly, cautiously, like people waking from a dream they did not understand. Doors opened a few inches, boots stepped back onto the boards, voices returned in low murmurs that avoided names and meaning. But the space around Ethan Cole and Clara remained untouched, like something had marked it invisible. Clara lowered her hand from the pendant, though her fingers still hovered near it, as if letting go too completely might undo whatever fragile truth had just revealed itself. She looked at Ethan, really looked this time, not at the stranger who had paid her debt, but at the man who had stayed when leaving would have been easier. You should not have done that, she said quietly, her voice no longer shaking, but carrying a different kind of weight. Ethan did not turn to her right away, his eyes still resting on the horizon where the riders had disappeared, as if measuring distance not in miles, but in time. Done what? He asked, calm, almost distant. Clara hesitated, searching for the right words, but finding none that could hold everything she meant. Stayed, she said finally. Ethan gave the smallest shake of his head, not in disagreement, but in correction. I did not stay, he replied. I just did not leave. The distinction hung between them, subtle, but real. Clara exhaled softly, her gaze dropping to the ground, then lifting again as if she had decided something she could not take back. They will return, she said, not as a warning, but as a fact. Ethan nodded once. Most things do. The wind moved across the street again, carrying with it the distant sound of a loose shutter tapping against a wall, the kind of small noise that fills silence when larger things have passed. Clara stepped closer, not enough to touch, but enough that the space between them no longer felt like distance. You do not even know who I am, she said. Ethan finally turned to face her fully, his expression unchanged, steady in a way that did not demand answers. You told me enough, he said. Clara frowned slightly, confusion and something softer crossing her features. I told you nothing. Ethan's eyes dropped briefly to the pendant, then back to her. You kept it, he said, and that seemed to be all the explanation he needed. Clara's breath caught again, not from fear this time, but from the quiet realization that he had seen more than she had said. She glanced down at the silver, turning it slightly between her fingers, watching the light move across its worn surface. "It was given to my mother," she said slowly, as if the words were being chosen as they came. "She told me it was not something you understand, only something you carry." Ethan listened without interrupting, his posture still, but attentive in a way that did not press. She said. Clara continued, her voice softer now, that if it ever had to be hidden, it meant the world had already forgotten what it was worth. The words settled deep, not just in the air, but somewhere older, somewhere that had been waiting. Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly, the only sign that something inside him had shifted. "Your mother," he said quietly. "Where did she get it?" Clara shook her head, a faint, almost sad motion. She never said. Only that it came from a man who never asked for it back. Ethan's eyes stilled, not widening, not reacting the way most men would, but going quiet in a way that suggested the answer had reached him before the question finished. Clara noticed, her gaze sharpening. "You know something," she said. Ethan did not deny it, but he did not confirm it either. Instead, he looked past her, toward the road that led out of town, the one that stretched for miles without promise. "I know," he said slowly, "that things like that do not travel without reason." Clara stepped back half a pace, studying him now the way the rider had before, as if seeing him not as a stranger, but as part of something she had been running from without knowing why. "Then why help me?" she asked again. But this time the question was different, deeper, not about money or timing, but about something neither of them had named yet. Ethan met her gaze, steady, unguarded in a way he had not been before. "Maybe I am not helping you," he said. Clara's brow furrowed slightly. "Then what are you doing?" Ethan looked once more at the pendant, then back at her, and for the first time, there was something close to truth in his voice, something that had been waiting longer than either of them knew. "Maybe," he said quietly. "I am just making sure it does not get lost again." The sun had begun its slow fall, not enough to cool the air, but enough to stretch the shadows across Redemption Street like long, quiet warnings, and in those shadows, something settled between Ethan Cole and Clara that neither of them spoke out loud. The town had returned to its business, but not fully, not the way it had before, because once people see something they cannot explain, they do not forget it, they just pretend to. Clara stood still for a moment longer, her fingers brushing the edge of the pendant again, not to hide it, but to understand its weight, as if it had changed simply by being seen. Ethan had already started walking, not away from her, but toward the edge of town where the road stretched open and uncertain. The same road the riders had taken, the same road that never truly led anywhere safe. Clara hesitated, then followed, her steps slower, unsure whether she was choosing the path or being pulled into it. "You are leaving," she said, catching up just enough to walk beside him. Ethan did not stop, his eyes fixed ahead. "I always am." The answer did not comfort her, but it did not surprise her either. The dust shifted under their boots as they moved past the last row of buildings, the sounds of the town fading behind them, replaced by the open quiet of the plains. Clara looked back once, just once, at the place she had nearly been erased from, and then she let it go. "They will not come back for me here," she said, more to herself than to him. Ethan shook his head slightly. "They will not come back for the place," he said. "They will come for the path." Clara frowned, turning that over in her mind. The path to where? Ethan did not answer immediately, because the answer was not a place, it was something else entirely. He slowed his pace just enough to reach into his coat pocket, pulling out a small, worn piece of leather, folded and aged by time. And for a moment he held it without opening it, like a man deciding whether to remember. Clara watched him, her curiosity rising with something deeper, something that told her this was not coincidence. "What is that?" she asked. Ethan unfolded it carefully, revealing a map. Hand-drawn, the lines faint but precise, marked with a trail that cut through valleys and ridges most people would avoid. Clara leaned closer, her eyes tracing the path, and then she froze, because at the center of that map, marked with a small, deliberate symbol, was a shape she recognized without ever having seen it before. Her hand moved instinctively to the pendant, her fingers tightening around it. "This is not possible," she whispered. Ethan looked at her, not surprised, not questioning. Just confirming what he had already begun to understand. Your mother did not find that by accident, he said. Clara shook her head slowly, her breath catching as pieces of something larger began to fall into place. She said it was a burden, she said, not a gift. Ethan folded the map again, slipping it back into his coat. Out here, he said quietly. Those are usually the same thing. The wind picked up slightly, brushing across the open land, carrying with it the faint echo of something distant, something that felt like movement even when nothing could be seen. Clara looked out across the horizon, her fear no longer sharp, but deeper now, more aware. If they find us again, she said, it will not be like before. Ethan nodded once, his gaze steady. No, he agreed. It will not. They stood there for a moment, side by side, not touching, not speaking, just looking out at a future that had already begun to move toward them. Clara took a slow breath, then another, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, something that had not been there when she knelt in the dust. Then do not walk away this time, she said. Ethan did not answer right away, because this was not a question he could treat like the others. He looked at her, really looked, and in that moment, the road ahead was no longer just his to choose. I was not planning to, he said finally, and somewhere beyond the ridge, where the riders had vanished, the silence shifted again, not empty, not still, but waiting, like the beginning of something that would not stop once it found them. The land did not change, but the way it felt did, like something unseen had begun to move beneath it, slow and certain, the kind of movement that does not stop once it starts. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of that quiet, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the light bent low and gold, measuring distance not by miles, but by what it would take to reach the end of it. Clara remained beside him, closer now than before, not by accident, but by choice she no longer questioned. The pendant rested steady against her chest, its weight no longer unfamiliar, but not yet understood. The wind carried a different sound this time, faint but distinct, not hoofbeats, not yet, but something that told of motion far off, like a promise keeping its pace. Clara heard it too, her shoulders tightening just slightly. They are already moving again, she said, not asking. Ethan gave a small nod, his gaze never leaving the distance. Men like that do not turn back without finishing what they started. Clara looked down at the ground, then out again, as if trying to see what he saw. Then why did they leave? Ethan shifted his weight, the dust under his boots pressing deeper. Because they were not the ones who decide how this ends. The answer settled between them, heavier than before, because it meant something else was coming, something neither of them had seen yet. Clara exhaled slowly, her hand brushing the pendant again, not out of fear, but as if grounding herself in something real. My mother used to say, she began, her voice quieter now, pulled from memory, that there were things you carry not to keep, but to deliver. Ethan glanced at her, just once, and something in that line reached further than she intended. Did she ever say where? He asked. Clara shook her head, a faint, almost distant motion, only that if I ever had to run, I was already too late. The words hung there, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The sky shifted another shade toward evening, the light thinning, stretching shadows longer across the open ground. Ethan reached into his coat again, not for the map, this time, but for something smaller, something worn smooth by years of being carried without purpose. He turned it once in his fingers before holding it out slightly, not offering it, just letting Clara see. It was a piece of silver, duller than her pendant, but shaped in a way that echoed it, not identical, but connected. Clara's breath caught, her eyes widening just enough to betray what she felt. That is, she began, but did not finish. Ethan closed his hand around it again, slow, deliberate. I did not know what it was, he said. Just that I was not supposed to lose it. Clara stepped closer without thinking, her voice barely above a whisper. My mother described it. She said there were two. Always 2-inch. Ethan looked at her now, fully, and for the first time, the distance between past and present felt thin enough to cross. Then she knew more than she said. He replied. Clara nodded slowly, her thoughts catching up to something her heart had already reached. She always did. The wind moved again, stronger this time, carrying dust across the open land, blurring the line between where they stood and what lay ahead. Ethan slipped the silver piece back into his coat, his posture settling into something firmer, not just a man passing through, but a man who had found the road meant for him. Clara followed his gaze out toward the horizon, her fear no longer sharp, but steady, shaped into something she could stand with. If there are two, she said, then they were never meant to stay apart. Ethan nodded once. Nothing that matters ever is. The sound came again then, clearer now, no longer distant enough to ignore. A faint echo of riders moving across the ridge, not the same as before, not measured in sevens, but in something harder to count. Clara heard it, and this time she did not step back. She stepped forward, just half a pace, aligning herself with him without hesitation. Ethan did not look at her, but he felt it, the shift, the choice made without words. "We do not have much time," she said. Ethan adjusted his stance, eyes steady, voice calm. "We have enough." The land stretched before them, wide and uncertain, and somewhere beyond the ridge, something was coming that would not turn away, not for silence, not for distance, not for anything less than what they carried. And this time, neither of them intended to run. The horizon no longer felt distant. It felt like it was moving toward them, slow and steady, the kind of movement that does not rush because it knows it will arrive. Ethan Cole stood with his weight settled evenly, not tense, not relaxed, just ready in the way a man becomes when he stops asking what comes next. Clara stood beside him, the pendant resting against her chest like it belonged there now. No longer hidden, no longer questioned, its presence quiet but undeniable. The wind carried the sound again, clearer this time, not scattered like before, but layered, as if more than one group rode across the land with purpose, each step measured, each mile closing the distance between choice and consequence. Clara listened carefully, her head tilting slightly as if trying to separate one rhythm from another. "That is not just one group," she said, her voice calm but certain. Ethan nodded once. "No," he replied. "It never is when something matters this much." Clara looked at him, searching his face for doubt, but finding none. "Then we are not just being followed," she said. "We are being found." The words settled deeper than anything before them, because they carried truth without fear. Ethan reached into his coat again, not hurried, not uncertain, and this time he unfolded the map fully, holding it between them so the fading light could catch the lines drawn across it. Clara leaned in, closer than before, her shoulder nearly brushing his as her eyes traced the path again, slower now, more carefully. "This path," she said, "it does not lead to a town, or a settlement, or anything meant for people to stay." Ethan nodded. "It leads to something people were not meant to forget." Clara's breath slowed as she followed the markings to the center, where the small symbol rested. The same shape echoed in the pendant, the same shape hidden in the piece of silver Ethan carried. "If both pieces point there," she said, "then it is not a destination. It is a return." Ethan folded the map halfway, his eyes still on the marked center, or a reckoning. The wind lifted stronger now, pulling at Clara's dress, brushing across Ethan's coat, carrying with it the faintest echo of voices, not loud enough to hear words, but enough to know they were there. Clara straightened, her fear no longer rising, but sharpening into something she could stand with. "My mother said something else," she added, her voice steady. "She said that when the two are brought together, it does not belong to the ones who carry it anymore." Ethan glanced at her, the lines settling into him slowly. "Then who does it belong to?" Clara looked back out at the horizon, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to see beyond what was visible. "To the truth it reveals." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with the weight of something approaching from more than one direction. Ethan folded the map completely now and slipped it back into his coat, his posture shifting just enough to show that whatever path lay ahead, he had already chosen to walk it. Clara noticed, and without hesitation, she stepped forward again, closing the small distance between them entirely this time, not behind him, not protected, but beside him, equal in the choice being made. The sound of riders grew clearer now, no longer distant, no longer uncertain, and this time, it did not come from one direction alone. Clara heard it, and this time she did not ask, She did not warn. She simply said, "They are not waiting anymore." Ethan's eyes moved slowly across the horizon, measuring each point where movement touched the edge of sight. "Neither are we." The land stretched wide around them, but it no longer felt open. It felt like it was closing in, guiding them towards something that had been waiting long before either of them had taken their first step onto this road. Clara lifted her hand, letting the pendant rest fully in the open, the silver catching the last light of the day, and for a moment, it felt less like something she carried and more like something that had found its way back. Ethan watched it briefly, then looked ahead again, his voice low, certain. "When they come into view," he said, "do not look at them." Clara turned slightly, confusion touching her expression. "Then what should I look at?" Ethan did not hesitate. "The path." Clara followed his gaze, out past the ridge, past the dust, toward the place marked on the map, the place that now felt closer than it had any right to be. And as the first distant figures began to form against the fading light, she understood what he meant, because whatever was coming for them was no longer the center of this story. It was only the force pushing them toward where they were always meant to go. The light was almost gone now, not vanished, but stretched thin across the land like something holding on for one last breath. And in that fading glow, the shapes on the horizon began to sharpen. No longer shadows, no longer guesses, but riders, many of them, moving in lines that did not follow the land but cut across it. Ethan Cole did not shift, did not step back. He only adjusted his stance slightly. The kind of movement that comes from understanding distance without measuring it. Beside him, Clara stood with her chin lifted just enough to see past the fear that had once defined her, her hand no longer reaching for the pendant, because she did not need to. It rested where it belonged, visible, steady, as if it had finally stopped hiding from its own purpose. The sound of hooves carried clearly now, layered and overlapping, not chaotic, but controlled, as if guided by something beyond the riders themselves. Clara watched the figures form, her eyes narrowing not in fear, but in recognition of what this moment meant. "They are not coming for us," she said slowly, the realization unfolding as she spoke it. Ethan glanced at her, just briefly. "No," he said. "They are coming because of what we carry." The difference settled heavy, because it meant this was never about escape, never about distance. It was about arrival. The riders spread across the ridge, not stopping, not rushing, their presence filling the space between sky and land in a way that made the world feel smaller, more focused. But something about them was different from before, not just in number, but in the way they moved, less like hunters, more like something drawn toward a fixed point. Clara took a slow breath, her voice quieter now, but stronger. "My mother said when the time comes, you will not need to run, because running will not take you anywhere." Ethan nodded once, his gaze still forward. "Then we do not run." The ground beneath them felt steady, unchanging, but the air carried a pressure that had not been there before, something building, something waiting for a moment neither of them could yet see. Ethan reached into his coat again, but this time he did not take out the map or the silver piece. He simply rested his hand there, as if confirming they were still with him, still real. Clara noticed, and something in her expression shifted, not fear, not doubt, but acceptance. "If they take it," she said, her voice calm, "it will not end this." Ethan looked at her now, fully, his eyes steady. "No," he said, "it will only begin it again." The riders slowed as they reached the lower edge of the ridge, their formation tightening, their movement no longer spread wide, but narrowing toward a single line that pointed directly toward Ethan and Clara. But still, they did not rush. They did not draw closer than needed, as if something unseen held them at a distance. Clara felt it, that invisible line, the same one Ethan had drawn earlier, but stronger now, anchored not by a man, but by something deeper. She stepped forward, just one step, not away from Ethan, not toward the riders, but toward the path beyond them. Ethan did not stop her, because he understood that this was not retreat, it was direction. The pendant caught the last thread of sunlight, flashing once, brighter than before, and for a moment, it felt like the land itself had noticed. The riders shifted, not back, not forward, but in response. their formation adjusting as if they had reached the edge of something they could not cross. Clara's voice came again, soft but certain. They cannot take it. Ethan followed her gaze, not at the riders, but beyond them, toward the place the map had marked, the place that now felt closer than distance could explain. No, he said. They can only follow it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of understanding, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be true. The riders held their position, no longer advancing, no longer testing, as if the purpose that had brought them here had reached its limit. Clara stood still, her shoulders relaxed, her breath even, no longer running, no longer hiding. Ethan remained beside her, not in front, not behind, but exactly where he needed to be. And as the last light slipped below the horizon, leaving the land in that quiet, in-between glow, it became clear that whatever was meant to happen next would not be decided by those who chased, but by those who chose to keep walking forward. Darkness did not fall all at once. It settled in layers, slow and patient, until the land itself seemed to hold its breath. And in that quiet, the riders remained where they were, no closer, no farther, as if something unseen had drawn a line none of them would cross. Ethan Cole stood still, his silhouette steady against the fading light. A man who had stopped measuring danger and started measuring meaning. Beside him, Clara did not look back toward the town anymore, because whatever she had been there, she had already left behind in the dust. The pendant rested against her chest, no longer just silver, no longer just memory, but something that felt anchored to the land itself. The wind moved softer now, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and distant earth, the kind of scent that lingers where paths have been walked long before they are remembered. Clara took a step forward, not hesitant, not forced, just deliberate. And the moment her boot pressed into the ground ahead, something shifted. It was not sound, not movement, but a feeling, like the land had answered. Ethan noticed it immediately, not with surprise, but with recognition, the kind that does not need explanation. He followed, one step, then another, not rushing, not pausing, just moving forward as if the direction had already been chosen long ago. Behind them, the riders watched, their formation holding, their purpose unchanged. Yet something in their stillness spoke louder than pursuit ever could. Clara felt it, that they were no longer chasing, they were witnessing. They are not following anymore, she said quietly. Ethan did not look back. No, he replied. They are waiting to see where this leads. The ground beneath their feet grew firmer as they moved, the loose dust giving way to something more settled, more certain, as if the path itself had been hidden beneath what others saw. Clara's eyes traced the land ahead, and for the first time, she could see it. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to know it was there, a line that did not belong to chance. It is here, she whispered, more to herself than to him. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed ahead. It always was. The pendant shifted slightly as she walked, catching what little light remained, and for a moment, it seemed to reflect more than it should, like it was drawing from something deeper than the sky above. Clara slowed, her breath steady but her thoughts racing. If this is the place, she said, then what happens when we reach it? Ethan stopped, just briefly, turning his head enough to look at her, and in that moment, there was no distance left between past and present in his eyes. We do not reach it, he said quietly. We remember it. The words settled into her, not as an answer, but as something that had been waiting to be understood. Clara took another step, and then another, each one more certain than the last, as if the path was not leading her forward, but calling her back. Behind them, one of the riders shifted in his saddle, not forward, not back, just enough to break the stillness, and the lead rider lowered his head slightly, not in defeat, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. They had come as far as they could. Clara felt it, even without looking. The moment something changed behind her, but she did not turn, because she knew it did not matter anymore. Ethan walked beside her, not guiding, not following, just present in the same direction, the same choice. The land ahead seemed to open, not wider, but deeper, like a place that had been waiting for footsteps to return. Clara's voice came again, softer now, but without doubt. My mother said the truth does not belong to the one who carries it. Ethan glanced at her. Just once. Then it is time to give it back. The wind moved once. More, stronger now, not pushing against them, but moving with them, as if the land itself had decided the direction was set. The riders remained behind, their purpose fulfilled not by taking, but by arriving at the edge of something they could not claim. And as Ethan and Clara stepped further onto the path that no longer needed to be hidden, it became clear that what lay ahead was not something to be protected from others, but something that would reveal itself only to those who chose to walk without turning back. The path did not appear all at once. It revealed itself in fragments, like memory returning in pieces too old to trust at first, and yet too familiar to deny. Ethan Cole slowed without stopping, his steps adjusting to something beneath the surface, something not marked by sight, but by knowing. And beside him, Clara felt it as well, the ground no longer uncertain, no longer shifting, but holding steady as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to be walked again. The air changed, subtle, but unmistakable, cooler despite the lingering heat of the day, carrying a stillness that did not belong to empty land, but to something that had not been disturbed in a long time. Clara's breath softened, her shoulders lowering without effort, and when she spoke, her voice carried no fear, only quiet recognition. "This is where it begins," she said. Ethan did not answer immediately, because he understood the difference now. This was not a beginning, it was a return, but some truths do not need correction. They need to be felt. The pendant rested against Clara's chest, unmoving, yet it seemed heavier now, not in weight, but in meaning, as if it had reached the place it was meant to belong. Ethan reached into his coat once more, slower this time, and brought out the second piece of silver, holding it in his palm without offering it yet, just letting it exist in the same space as hers. Clara turned slightly, her eyes drawn to it, and for a moment, neither spoke, because the connection between the two pieces was no longer a question. The shapes aligned in a way that did not require explanation, not identical, but complete when seen together. "My mother said they were never meant to be held apart," Clara whispered. Ethan nodded once, his gaze steady. "Then we should not be the ones who keep them that way." The wind stilled almost completely, as if the land itself had paused, waiting, and Clara took a step closer, lifting the pendant from her chest, her hand steady now, no hesitation left in her movement. Ethan extended his hand slowly, not commanding, not guiding, just present, and when the two pieces came near each other, something shifted, not visibly, not with sound, but with a feeling that moved through the ground, through the air, through them. Clara's breath caught, not from fear, but from something deeper, something that felt like recognition beyond her own memory. Ethan felt it too, the same quiet certainty settling into place, like a story completing itself without needing to be told. For a moment, time seemed to hold, stretched thin between what had been and what was about to be understood. Then Clara lowered her hand, not to give the pendant away, but to let it rest near Ethan's, the two pieces close enough to belong together, but not yet joined. "What if this is not about joining them?" she said softly. "What if it is about knowing why they were separated?" Ethan looked at her, and this time, there was no distance in his gaze, only agreement. "Then we listen," he said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with something that did not need words, something that had been waiting longer than either of them could measure. Behind them, far in the distance, the riders remained where they were, no longer moving, no longer approaching, because whatever had drawn them here had reached its limit. Clara did not look back. She did not need to, because she understood now that they were no longer part of this moment. Ethan stood beside her, not as a protector, not as a guide, but as someone who had been brought to the same place by a different path. The land stretched around them, quiet and still, but no longer empty. And for the first time, Clara felt that what she carried was not a burden, not something to hide or escape, but something that had found its way back to where it belonged. Ethan closed his hand gently around the silver piece, not to take it away, but to hold it with purpose, and when he spoke again, his voice was low, steady, and certain. "Whatever this is," he said, "it was never meant to be claimed." Clara nodded, her hand still holding the pendant near his, her voice just as certain. "It was meant to be remembered." And in that quiet space, where the path no longer needed to be followed and the past no longer needed to be chased, the truth began to rise, not as something new, but as something that had been waiting all along for someone to stop running long enough to see it. The moment did not arrive with noise or force. It settled the way truth always does out here, quiet, steady, and impossible to ignore once it takes hold. Ethan Cole stood with the small piece of silver resting in his palm, Clara beside him with the pendant held just inches away, and in that narrow space between them, something older than both of them began to take shape. It was not light, not something the eye could fully see, but something felt, a stillness that pressed outward, reaching into the ground beneath their boots and the air around their breath. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to listen, because for the first time, she understood that this was not something to act on, it was something to receive. Her mother's voice returned to her then, not as memory, but as presence, steady and certain, the way it had always been when she needed it most. Do not carry it like it is yours, the voice seemed to say. Carry it until it finds its place. Clara opened her eyes slowly, her hand no longer trembling, no longer unsure, and without hesitation, she moved the pendant closer, not to join it, not to force anything, but simply to let it be where it belonged. Ethan watched her, not guiding, not questioning, just present, his own hand steady as the second piece remained open to the moment. The space between them closed, not by touch, but by purpose, and in that instant, the weight they had both carried shifted, not lifted, but changed, as if it had finally found the ground it had been searching for. The wind returned, soft at first, then fuller, moving through the land with a sound that did not belong to emptiness anymore. Clara felt it pass through her, not cold, not warm, just certain, and when she spoke, her voice carried that same certainty. It was never about keeping it safe, she said. It was about bringing it back. Ethan nodded once, his gaze steady, and knowing when to stop holding it. The silver in his hand seemed different now, not brighter, not heavier, just complete in a way it had not been before. Clara lowered her hand slowly, letting the pendant rest again against her chest, but it no longer felt like something she carried alone. Ethan closed his hand gently around his piece, then just as gently, he loosened his grip, letting it sit open in his palm once more, not claimed, not hidden. Behind them, far across the distance, the riders remained still, their purpose fulfilled not by taking, but by witnessing what they could not claim. The lead rider lowered his head again, not in defeat, but in respect, and one by one, the others turned their horses, not away in retreat, but in understanding that their place was not here anymore. Clara did not look back. She did not need to, because she felt it, the moment. Something released its hold on her, not by force, but by completion. Ethan stepped forward then, not toward anything visible, but along the path that had revealed itself beneath them. And this time, Clara walked with him without hesitation. The land stretched ahead, quiet and open, but no longer uncertain, because whatever had been waiting here was no longer waiting. They walked in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing needed to be said anymore. After a few steps, Clara glanced at him, her expression calm, grounded. "What happens now?" she asked. Ethan did not look at her, his eyes on the path ahead, but his voice carried something steady, something resolved. "Now it belongs to where it always should have," he said. Clara let that settle, her hand resting lightly over the pendant, not holding it, just acknowledging it. And for the first time since she could remember, it did not feel like a burden. It felt like something she had helped complete. The wind moved with them, not behind, not against, but alongside. And in that quiet motion, the story that had begun long before either of them had taken part in it came to rest without needing an ending. Because out here, not every truth needs to be spoken. Some just need to be returned. And when they are, the land remembers, the silence holds, and the people who carried it are free to walk on without looking back.